Hi, everyone. Welcome to Critical Conversations 2021. My name is Kamalini Ramdas, and I'm Festival Academic Advisor for this year's Campus Arts Festival, brought to you by the Center for the Arts at NUS. As I mentioned, we're at Critical Conversations, and it is usually the event that marks the start of festival season here on campus. And I'm really excited because this year's theme is a question of time, right? And as many of you know, we're going through an exceptional moment in history right now with COVID. So time has really become really important to all of us. And I'm sure we're reflecting on this deeply. And these critical conversations aim to ask those kinds of questions about time. So today we have the first of three critical conversations. And we're talking about a measure of time in a COVID world, right? So with critical conversations, the aim is to sort of discuss topics and issues around time and temporality, drawing from philosophy, arts, film, and historicity, right? And ask questions around who or what frames time, how to understand time or conceptions of time, right? How does politics fit into our sense of time? I'm a geographer, right? And so often I'm talking about space. But most geographers, if you talk to geographers, and we have Tracy over there, right, will tell you that space and time are intertwined. And if you speak to a philosopher, they'll probably have something really important to say about time and temporality as well. So I'm really excited today because we're starting off a measure of time in a COVID world. And I'm going to read to you the blurb about this particular critical conversation, right? Time is someone. And so Merleau-Ponty invites us to discover how our experience and measure of time is always connected to our consciousness of self and our relationships with each other and others. Between ruminations on the phenomenology of time and COVID-bound psychological research to mapping how time features in social life and their implications on various communities, this conversation between Dr. Chuan from philosophy and Associate Professor Tracy Skelton from geography invites us to explore the unexpected ways to understand or measure how time passes that may signal towards a new order of social relations in years to come. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my guests, okay? This is for the benefit of people online, because I know many of the people here in the room with us know our guests already because you're either from geography or philosophy, right? So thank you for joining us here face to face. So Dr. Chuan is a philosopher at the Department of Philosophy and a counselor in training. He leads a popular cross-faculty module on everyday ethics in Singapore. His latest research focuses on self-compassion in sexual minorities. During the recent pandemic, he completed a 10-month counseling practicum at a psychiatric rehabilitation home. That's my first guest, right? My second guest, Associate Professor Tracy Skelton, is an interdisciplinary geographer who focuses on social justice issues in relation to gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, and disability through social, political, feminist, and cultural lenses. She is the editor for the journal Children's Geographies and is also the editor-in-chief for Geographies of Children and Young People. Her most recent research project was funded by a SSHRCC grant focusing on young people and employment in Singapore and Canada. So we have with us two different and yet similar takes on time and temporality. So we're going to talk about a measure of time today. And so each of our guests will be given a little bit of time, time to share with us their thoughts on the theme, right? So we'll start off with Chuan Fei, right? And then we'll have Tracy come in, right? And when they're done, I'll be asking them some questions. And we'll also be taking questions from you guys here who are with us, as well as those of you online, right? You have the opportunity of sending in your questions online, right? So without further ado, I'd like to give the time over to Chuan Fei right now to share with us his thoughts on a measure of time.
Okay, thank you very much, Kamal, and thank you to the Center for the Arts for this invitation. I thought I'll take the opportunity to raise some questions about our experiences of pandemic time. I'm going to begin with a kind of paradox that can arise about these experiences, and then I'll say something about how phenomenology and psychotherapy, two different ways of raising questions and inquiring about ourselves, can help to make sense of this paradox. So at this time, this pandemic time of lockdown and after, I often feel a little out of sync with time, struggling to find the right times to do this and that, and the right measures of time for them. And I'll venture that others may have felt the same as well. Right? Our routine uses of time have gotten disrupted by a whole range of new tasks, changing schedules of work and rest. We have living through more and more screens, right? And tending in new ways to loved ones nearby and far apart. Yeah. Balancing, right, between our private priorities and public health. All these decisions and things to be done. And yet the experiences, right, we have of disrupted time, right, struggling to find right times, right measures of time, all this is unfolding in time, right? So we reach a kind of paradox, right, in our experiences here. This is what it feels like to be out of sync, right, with time, and out of sync in time, both at the same time, right? So our invitation to today's conference, right, began with a prompt from the organizers. And the prompt is, time is someone, right? And it's a wonderful quotation from the French philosopher Merleau-Ponty. And he's thanked by many philosophers, some psychologists, some cognitive scientists, right, for reminding us that perception, right, or perceptual experiences comes from an embodied perspective, right? And he makes a kind of related point about temporal experiences, right? How we experience time, yeah. And if we think of time, right, as this series of moments, right, this succession of moments, one after the other, right, independent of ourselves, it's very hard to explain why we have experiences of time kind of rushing by, right? Or time slowing down, right? Or experiences of ourselves having too much time on our hands or having too little. Yeah. So Merleau-Ponty's thought, right, his invitation to us is to think about each moment of time in the present as connected in some ways, as embedded with already the past and the future, right? So the present that has already gone by and the present that's yet to come, yeah? So just as a kind of object that we see, right, out there is partly defined by the ways that we have moved around it and defined by the ways that we can go on to move with it, right? A moment in time, right, on his picture, a moment in the present, is partly defined by how we have lived, right, and how we can live, yeah, after this. You can think of each moment as arriving, right, in the present with a kind of history and a horizon. Yeah. So take this very moment now, right, of our conversation, right, when we're looking at each other before me, and I have you as a captive audience, right? And we might reflect a little on that history of connections that brought us to this moment, right? And the horizon of possibilities that will follow. Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to extend today Merleau-Ponty's invitation to us with two sorts of questions about the passing of pandemic time. Yeah? First question, right? How are these experiences of the present, right, including these experiences of disrupted time, of being out of sync with time, how are they connected to past and future, right? How do they have a history and a horizon? How are they connected with our habitual uses of time, right? And our new anxieties, right, about how to spend time. Yeah. Okay. So we normally depend, right, so much on other people, the people we live in, work with, to help us demarcate time, right? This is time for work, time for rest, time to spend on ourselves, time to spend on other people. And in periods of social isolation, right, or transition, we do without some of these structures and supports. Yeah. And in some ways, the horizons, right, of our present moment also look murkier, right? New uncertainties associated with health, with employment, right? With travel, right? Border controls. Okay, so first question. Second question, right? How are all these experiences of time related to our social roles? So I have heard from parents, for example, right, who struggle with facing their families all the time now, right? Every hour of the day when they have to work from home, right? Or work longer hours at home. Yeah. And yet, how they report this struggle is a little different, right? Some experience this as time speeding up, a lot more to do, but some are also reporting this as time slowing down, right? Interminably, as they have to try and discover new ways of facing each other. So if we speak a little here of social roles, we're going to have to chat a little about social differences as well, right? In these experiences of time. Okay, so two questions. I'll add a third of my own, right, which is about what do these experiences of disrupted time, right, what do they tell us about ways of being well, right? What do they tell us about what it means to be well, right? Or what it means to be unwell? So one of the privileges, right, of being a philosopher is you get to step back sometimes and watch the other disciplines uh, rush, right, into swift action. You know? And I'm a huge admirer of the psychological sciences, the social sciences, the health sciences. And they have produced, right, very quickly, right, a lot of interesting research about how people, right, manage, right, disrupted time, right, different populations, what kinds of resources they draw on, you know, the measures of resilience. And in different classes that I teach, I'm having students examine, right, how all these scientists, right, are cobbling together, right, ad hoc measures of what counts as well-being, right, in this pandemic time. Yeah? So trying to find some way, right, to get the science going, and to do so, they have to somehow measure, right, what counts as well-being. So the example I had in mind was, you know, this one I discussed with some of the seminar students on philosophy of social science. Is a group of psychologists who wanted to compare the impact of two kinds of experiences in quarantine on welfare, right? On well-being in the quarantine. The two kinds of experiences are being mindful of the present, and the other kind is being absorbed in meaningful activity. Yeah. And they collected really an impressive amount of data very quickly. And this was in Wuhan, right? Last February. So this is at the height of uncertainty, right, around how this was going to evolve, right? What was going to happen in the pandemic. But what caught our attention, my students and me, were the ways in which these scientists, these psychologists, measured what they called well-being in a time of stressful uncertainty, right? So they gathered a series of scales and measures, right, traditional ones, for measuring experiences of worry, of loneliness, of negative emotions, positive emotions, depression and anxiety symptoms, and what they call health-related activities or behaviors. Now, I have some doubts myself about whether or not mindfulness, right, can be meaningfully assessed using some of these measures. But at a more basic level, right, I wonder what it means to be well, right, in pandemic time, yeah, and whether our normal measures and scales, right, are apt for these disrupted and out of sync lives. Yeah? So to put it a little bluntly, right, I might consider myself rather unwell if I didn't respond, right, to a lockdown in Wuhan with heightened levels of fear, uncertainty, depression. You know, I might even permit myself one or two unhealthy behaviors, right? And for everyone's reference here, the list of unhealthy behaviors include eating junk food, smoking cigarettes, having 3 or more alcoholic beverages in a week. Yeah, so I'll end with just one last story, right? This one about revisiting our senses of what counts as normal. So as Kamal was describing, I was in the middle of a practicum in a psychiatric rehabilitation home throughout the lockdown period. And months into the lockdown in Singapore, one of my clients mentioned that he was bored, right? He was feeling very bored. And with social distancing enforced in his workplace, he was still going out to work. He was often by himself, right? Just surrounded in this space with surveillance, circuitry, but no one else, right? And before the lockdown, right, he could go have a chat with someone else, a colleague, or he might have a smoke with a stranger, right? And but now he was always bored, right? Waiting for hour upon hour to pass, right? And we were in session, so I empathized, right, with his loneliness, right? And then I just suggested, is there something fun you could do, something interesting, right? You could try to learn, yeah? And then we kind of moved on to talk about other things. Okay. So I mean, who amongst us, right, hasn't been bored? And I offered my suggestions, and we went on to talk about other things. And at the next session, when we resumed again meeting, he told me how upset he had been with me, right? That I hadn't been listening at all to him, he said. So no, thank you very much. He didn't need a hobby. He didn't need a friend. He didn't need something new to learn, right? And I was taken aback, but within the space, I tried to listen more carefully, right? This time more patiently to his sense of boredom, right? An experience of boredom. And without the distraction of a chat with someone else or a cigarette, right, or smoke, he was discovering, right, that his hours were passing without enough meaning, right? And what he was asking of our conversation was, he wanted more meaning, right, from his life. And so I apologized, right, once that became clear. So I leave us then with these 3 questions, right, about our pandemic time. So number 1, how is our experience of the moment now, disrupted time, out of sync with time, related to habitual users of our time? All these new anxieties, right, expectations that we have to manage. How is it related to our changing social roles, right? And how might it be related to our sense, right, of what counts as living well, living meaningfully? Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Chuan Fei, for sharing. I think you leave us with these 3 questions, and we can definitely pick up on them later when we have time for question and discussion. I now like to invite Tracy Skelton to share with us her thoughts on a measure of time in a COVID world.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. So I just apologize in advance in case I drop pieces of paper, because I'm struggling a few things of clicking and speaking and so forth. So we'll see how it goes. So for this short presentation on a measure of time in a COVID world, I reflect upon felt, experienced, and lived impacts of the pandemic. Using a feminist perspectives and politics, I draw upon my research areas of expertise in children and young people's geographies, alongside geographies of gender and sexualities. This intertwining marks a recognition of people who are marginalized or even excluded within many societies, including here in Singapore. And at the same time, I celebrate the ways in which other countries, such as my home country of the UK, have created and legislated equality, recognition, and inclusion. I mean, not completely, and there's problems with that, but nevertheless, that's the kind of process. So in examining time within a COVID world, I see strong connections between children, young people, and people who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and indeterminate, intersexed, for short, LGBTQ. So I want to critically engage with a set of 4 questions that Chuan and I were asked by Marianne and the organisers of the event, and interweave children and youth and LGBTQ people into my responses. In the second part of the talk, I will explore the relatively new concept of solastalgia. I'm still getting my tongue around that, so of solastalgia, in a twist of analysis of loss, waiting, and homesickness in place. So I'm just going to give my responses, but you can see the questions up there on the slides. In the context of my research, and what I have most thought about in this pandemic at a personal level has been children and young people, and those groups who are marginalized and held in a form of immobility and enforced stillness. Children and young people often want to rush through time, grow older, become taller, so that they can enter the world of time where they can be active, do things, get to the next celebratory event, or a rite of passage, and to be someone, i.e. to be a child no longer. Sadly, so many children and young people have not been able to celebrate or mark those positive longed-for experiences, such as birthdays, first day at school, success in exams, graduating, festive seasons, and they can't process those or experience those in the usual exciting and anticipated ways. For marginalized groups, such as the LGBTQI community, there is an enforced waiting as they are held outside of society and are not recognized as fully made, rather infantilized, ignored, or excluded. COVID-19 has enforced time negatively in many different ways, and waiting negatively is more widely experienced by marginalized groups. Lockdowns, enforced dwelling, spatial restrictions, new working and studying regimes have created time as something that can be causing anguish, annulment, and anxiety. Just get myself organized. Response 2. This was where we were asked about advice that we'd give to people who are struggling and adapting. So these were my responses. Try to accept the fact that global and local time have changed and we have to adapt. But we must also remember what time was, what it felt like, and how it functioned prior to COVID-19. We have all become humans in waiting, held in a form of stasis. But at the same time, and isn't it interesting how often we use this word time for so many meanings, but at the same time, finding ourselves rushed and overburdened with new forms of labor, disruptions, and deadlines. So reflecting on time we had before and how we used it is important to hold on to. Our very near pasts are still lingering, they're still memorable, and we may be able to return to them, ironically, at some point in the future. But we need to think more about how we should treasure time rather than squander it. If the world slows down notably in the new formations founded by COVID-19, then that might be a better way to realize our humanity, the importance of caring and inclusive approaches towards each other, our responsibilities and focus on time we should give to save our shared planet. This is response 3. We should work to recognize the multiplicity of time, learn more about how different parts of the world and people in those places work with time rather than against time. Time means so many things to different people, and it is a precious entity. We should try to reformulate what we mean by waiting and find the positives. For many people, however, time is forced onto and out of people, inhumane working conditions, languishing in carceral spaces of control and containment, waiting endlessly for support, care, recognition. Time should not be a privilege for the wealthy. It should be shared as a form of wealth across humanity. Time to sleep, to eat, to care for someone, to be happy, to love, to be loved, to raise a family, to create a home, to include others, to learn, and to just stop for times that matter. sorry, that should stay there. Time as a character, this is the question we were asked at the end, which I found quite interesting. So what would we do if we thought about time as a character? For me, it was that it can be painfully slow or frighteningly fast. Time makes us wait, or it delivers something that we need or feel or desire or we want to have swiftly. Impatience is a negative character of time. Time spent with generous and kind characters is so valuable and worthwhile. The latter should be cherished and the former softened. So those were my responses, and I hope that they've stimulated ideas for critical conversations. In the remaining minutes, I want to introduce the notion of solastalgia and adapt it for this conversation with particular reference to children and young people. Just there on the slide, you can see some reminiscences of mine, of my experience of being locked out from the country where everything I had was in Singapore, and I was placed somewhere else, trapped somewhere else for a period of time. So in the concept of solastalgia then, this is something that I've started to explore on the basis of my invitation to this critical conversation. So it might be a little rough and ready around the edges. Solastalgia is a neologism coined by Glenn Albrecht in 2005 to capture forms of emotional or existential distress caused by environmental change. He formed the word by a combination of the Latin word solicium, meaning comfort, and the Greek word root algia, pain. So putting together solace and pain. In 2015, the Lancet Medical Journal included solastalgia as a concept related to the impact of climate change on human health and well-being. So you can see that it's been taken up in very interesting ways. And here, just for you to reflect, I'm just going to show two last images to hopefully calm you down and make you feel a little bit at well-being. So, differentiated from nostalgia, the melancholia or homesickness experienced by individuals when separated from loved home, solastalgia is the distress that is produced by environmental change, impacting on people while they are directly connected to their home environment. Albrecht describes it as, quote, the homesickness you have when you are still at home, and your home environment is changing in ways you find distressing. Reading about solastalgia, it struck me that this conceptually encapsulated what so many children and young people have experienced during their measures of time in a COVID world. People exposed to environmental change experience negative effects that are exacerbated by a sense of powerlessness or lack of control over the unfolding change process. And this can be particularly impactful on LGBTQI. As a result of the pandemic and governmental state management or mismanagement, many children and young people have been confined at home for hours and days, unable to see their friends, elderly relatives, neighbors, and other significant people in their lives. For teenagers, the carceral style of dwelling is particularly intense and impactful. At the time of their lives, when they are forging their identities and subjectivities, they are locked in with families rather than with their multiple significant others, their friends and peers. They experience a form of what I'm calling a friend sickness. And so many can see no end to their containment, restrictions, risks, and their frustrations. So many fear for their futures and who and what they might be able to be or become. Children and young people are bored, missing each other, wishing for the past, daily, quite mundane experiences. Many have lost their independent ability, their laughter, playfulness, amusement, choices, time together, strong friendships, aspirations, and positive expectations. They are at home, but the environment around them has changed in ways they find distressing, and they're deeply anxious about their futures, those of their families, communities, and nations. Solastalgia captures what thousands of people are going through and have gone through. During this pandemic, children and young people have been exposed to frightening information, witnessed the distress and anxiety faced by their parents and loved ones. They know, for some and for many now, they know that poverty and vulnerability are not far away. And very many, as shown by all the Save the Planet activities, deeply fear what is happening and what is being done to our Earth. They have been through too much negatively. So now is the time, and I've written that in capital letters, now is the time for care, acceptance, support, encouragement, advocacy, inclusion, and love. They need our provision of the precious quality of time to recover from this damaging pandemic. We should all do what we can to recuperate and recapture their childhoods and youth. We all have to work for hope in positive and inclusive ways for children, young people, and LGBTQI folk. That is what a just and caring society does.
Thank you, both Tracy and Chuan, for sharing your thoughts. I'm going to start us off right now with the critical conversations portion, where I'm going to ask a couple of questions. So as a warm-up, okay, I'd like to start us off from a disciplinary perspective, I guess, and have each of you reflect a little bit about your sort of disciplinary background. So we'll start off with Chuan, and maybe I'd like to ask you, how have philosophy and your more recent experiences with counseling helped you to conceptualize time similarly or differently? I want to use the wordplay here on lived experience and reliving moments. So I guess in some ways, the intervention, we were asked to think about time as lived, right? And yet with counseling and your experiences with counseling, in many ways, people are articulating and sharing what they have already gone through. There's a kind of reliving, a telling of the story again, right? So maybe if you could reflect a little bit on how these two aspects of your sort of life currently, right? Your philosophical sort of tradition and your current sort of counseling experience, how are they helping or influencing the way you think about time and temporality?
Thank you very much, Kamal. I'll need you to stop me if I ramble too long. So it's a good question about disciplines. And the one thing I did take note of, right, is to emphasize, right, that I very much regard myself as in training, right? I'm still in counseling and psychotherapy, still learning so much from instructors, from my clients, and learning about myself too, in that respect. So I'll say something about maybe the increasing connections I see between phenomenology and psychotherapy. And there are other broader connections between philosophy and counseling. But with phenomenology, I described some ways in which Merleau-Ponty's ideas, right, can be very striking. And he's like an old friend in some ways that I'm rediscovering in new ways. And he's often called a philosopher of ambiguity, right, or indeterminacy, or the in-between, because he was so interested in the ways in which we tended to divide up experiences, right, and carve them out according to distinctions of mind, body, self, other, nature, nurture, or nature, culture, and what he described, right, in the phenomenology of perception and other writings are the ways in which, if you paid attention to lived experiences and trying to describe these lived experiences accurately, some of these distinctions begin to blur, right? It was quite hard to, you had to invent concepts almost, right, that were in between, right, all these distinctions of self, other, of mind, body, of nature, nurture. And I think before this, I had a certain intellectual understanding, right, of what he might mean. But it was astonishing to discover in session with this, in chatting to my clients, the ways in which, when we are recounting their lived experiences and they're describing them, all those themes came up, right? Ways in which they are constantly themselves struggling with the distinction between mind and body, between nature and nurture, between the self and other, between what counts as normal and abnormal, right, or pathological. These are distinctions, right? They are constantly struggling in between as well, right? So a more concrete example, maybe following on what I was sharing about temporal experiences, right? So Merleau-Ponty is sometimes called the philosopher of time, right? Because of his reflections on moments. But he's also the philosopher of the body, right? Because he regarded all of these moments, right? These experiences of time as embodied experiences, right? So in asking us to think about temporal experiences as having a history and having a horizon, he means also for us to reflect on the ways in which this history and that horizon is partly, right, embedded in our bodies, right? So the habitual uses of time, right, that we have gotten used to, that builds in a set of automatic responses, right, and expectations in our bodies too. And think of the ways in which in counseling, for example, responses to threats, right, or to trauma, right, we've discovered have built in certain bodily responses, right, automatic responses sometimes to stress, to threats. And those are things that I think I've only begun to explore and learn how to manage, right, how to encourage my clients, myself, to listen to our bodies in these situations. And as part of our lived experiences, right, that these bodily signals may be significant for us too. Yeah. Maybe one further thought about what counseling, right, or the counseling space has brought to me is a real attention to setting, right, to the space of discussion. Right? It's not like reading a book where I'm analyzing Merleau-Ponty and sharing it with students, but there's something distinctive about how counseling, right, forces your attention on the process of what's occurring, how you're creating a particular space with your tone of voice, with your stance to the person that you are speaking to. And questions become very different, right, in those changes with tones of voice, with that space. Think about that little exercise, right, I was encouraging us to do, reflecting on this moment, thinking about that history, thinking about the horizon. That invitation looks very different, right, depending on the setting that we are in, and the tone of welcome or the invitation, right, or harsher tone, right, about history. Consider the history they brought you here. Consider the horizons, right, before you. And I mean, that's only, I think, just begun to influence my ways of thinking about what occurs in philosophical dialogue too, or in teaching, right, in my discussions with students. Yeah, I think.
Thanks so much. I think you've given us a lot to think about. So I pick up on this notion, of course, as a geographer, of the context or space in which we think about being in sync or out of sync. And the second point here is about who gets to say they're out of sync or in sync, right? There's a politics around, why is it that some people constantly feel they're out of sync, whether or not it's COVID, and others who only now suddenly feel they're out of sync, right? Because of COVID, right? So I think there's a politics to that kind of sense of being in or out of sync. And I think I want to invite Tracy here, right, to reflect a little bit on the space that geography gives us to think about time, and also her own research and experience working with young people and other marginalized groups to reflect a little bit about what being out of sync is like for marginalized groups.
Thank you. Thanks, Kamal. And thank you for your discussion as well. Yes, so as geographers, one of the things we're always working about, and certainly when I have students who come into my classes on geographies of social life or geographies of children and young people, they want to know how come it's geography and not sociology. So I have to work quite hard at sort of explaining that. And one of our key facets in geography, of course, is the significance and importance of space and place. And for us, it's kind of, for geographers and geographical perspectives, then it's really central that space and place and people are seen as kind of interconnections with each other. They work together always. So people make places, people make spaces, and spaces and places make people as well. So that interaction is always happening. And that means that when time comes in, and something like a pandemic sweeps through, then suddenly space becomes transformed as well. So it's not just time that gets shifted, slowed down or speeded up, or becomes something that you become sort of oppressed by, or it's something that you celebrate. But space is similar as well, in the sense of it's a recognition of a sense of belonging. And for many people, sense of belonging is really, really important. So one of the things that through my research with young people and other marginalized groups, including LGBTQI, but also people with disabilities and young deaf people as well, I've worked with, is the sense in which who can access these particular spaces, who have the resources to utilize them, what choices do people have? And of course, in lots and lots of different ways, people have different ways in which they can connect with spaces and enter a new space, feel comfortable in a new space or place, or they can adapt. And so if you have resources, if you've got space, you can adapt very differently. So if you think about lockdowns around the world that were going on, and of course we saw lots of footage at the beginning of it in Italy as well, because that's where things really kicked off, an early a late sort of lockdown in terms of practice, but nevertheless. And there, you know, we've got to think about the ways in which the home as space, what size is it? Literally, these are very practical things. How many people can comfortably be there for longer periods of time, locked down, not able to leave, or only to leave for half an hour and so forth? What happens to people who really don't like their families, or there is conflict in the family? And there may have been bullying and ignoring of people. Somebody, you know, may have come out to their family as gay, and the family just doesn't cope very well with it and rejects it. And then suddenly you're in lockdown with those people where those things have happened. So this means that time can kind of be very powerful, but of course the role of space is also extremely powerful in terms of who can be in spaces comfortably and other people who are in spaces very uncomfortably. And of course, space opens up for people. If you're happy, you're confident, you're happy with who you're with, you think you've got your own bedroom, you might even have your own bathroom. Other people in closed spaces are suddenly confined to extreme examples of trying to find a little niche space. And when you add into that people working from home on top, as raising families and so forth, then it becomes even more complicated and sophisticated. And so people will be under extreme stress. So for us as geographers, then the role of space and place and who can be and access those is very important. And to think about how we can support people who are in very difficult spaces and places.
Hello? Okay, hi. Sorry. Thanks so much, Tracy. So I'm conscious of time, right? And I know there are a lot of puns, right? I apologize. It's a very popular word today. I would like to maybe ask a question here and then give a moment, ask you guys to reflect a little bit more positively about something. And then I'd like to maybe take some time for questions here from you, the audience. And then we're going to have some questions coming for us online. So if you're online and you have a question, please type that in. I see questions coming in as well. So, but as the sort of person who's moderating, I want to ask you guys to reflect a little bit about boredom and waiting. So in some sense, right, both of you talked about waiting and boredom in ways that were, you know, you were struggling with this. Always there is a negativity that is implied in it. And Tracy uses this term also, the negative aspects of waiting. Can we see boredom and waiting as positive things, right? So what is it that COVID has taught us about boredom that we might be hopeful about and waiting, right? So are there positive aspects to boredom and waiting? Maybe let's start off with Chuan Fei here.
Okay. Thank you very much. And there's so much that I want to respond to in what Tracy had shared earlier too, but I'll respond to Kamal. So I hope that little vignette I offered at the end, right, speaks a little bit to the ways in which that sense of boredom might be something meaningful, right, in its own right, productive or clarifying, right, about what we expect, even in normal life. And that was one example. I think also of ways in which, you know, many of my clients, right, in some ways dealt better with the waiting under pandemic time than I did, right? Because they are in a space where for a long time they were already in this transitional time where they were waiting, right? They were waiting for recovery, right? Waiting to heal, waiting for new accommodation, right? Waiting for more settled forms of employment. And so in many ways, they had these resources, right, within which to live with that boredom, right? And I was always struck by how creative they were, right, in this balance between distracting themselves, right, during these occasions of boredom, or taking time out to reflect, right, on their goals, right? Their meanings. And this includes possibly some of the mistakes they may feel they have made, right? And reflect on their past, right? In gentler ways. Right? So that's one thought. I have one further thought about waiting, right? And this is drawn a little from my current research, which connects up with Tracy's research on the LGBT community. So I've been doing some research about experiences of self-compassion, right, in gay men. And one of the spaces within which they are often waiting is the closet, right? Yeah, where they are waiting to announce themselves, to present themselves in public, to announce themselves to family members, and that again, that space of waiting, that time can feel like suspension. But in my interviews, it's also very striking how much that waiting time is also in some ways a kind of self-care, right? Where they are carefully preparing themselves, right? And their senses of self and independence, they are weighing their judgments about causing other people anguish, hurting other people, and they're taking their time, right, in this waiting, in this closet space to make certain important decisions. And maybe that's one way in which we might see waiting as partly informed by politics. I think I learned that actually from Dr. Ramdas's research. Maybe you should share something about women in waiting, but it is informed by politics, informed by constraints, but people respond to it creatively, right? With unexpected sources of resilience. Yeah.
Thanks, Chuan Fei. Tracy, what about you?
Can you remind me? Is
Sure.
boredom and waiting?
So can you speak a little bit about boredom, maybe through your research on young people? How do young people look at waiting and boredom, right? What are some creative ways in which they might help us to think positively about something that many see as negative, right? As stasis.
Yeah, I think that's really important. Of course, it's determined by the spaces they're in, of where they can go, how many people they can meet up with, whether they can wear their masks, whether not, and so forth. So, but because the research I've mostly done with young people have been in what we would call, the pre-pandemic era. And so they could hang out with their mates and stand by the street corner and so forth. So I think it's a common refrain amongst young people that they're bored. Oh, so boring and so forth. But what's interesting is the ways in which they then work to be bored and kind of complain about boredom, but nevertheless make themselves active and engaged. So I did this wonderful project. It's still one of the early ones. It wasn't funded or anything. It just happened to be where I was volunteering and I'd got some sabbatical leave. So I was in a different place in the South Wales valleys. And these young women I met and wanted to sort of get in touch with, and they agreed to being part of the project, was laughter and the jokes and stories and reminding each other of things. So because they said to me in the interview, the meeting, I had everything set up, and they said, we're not doing any writing, we're not talking about school, we're definitely not reading anything. So, if you want all of that, you can't have it, because we're here to be friends with each other. And I said, that's fine, let's go with it. I'll just ask you a few questions. And then off they went. And it was one of the most joyous research experiences ever, because they were so funny. And that laughter and connection, particularly for teenagers, older teenagers learning their skills. I mean, I used to get thrown out of classes because the boys behind me were so funny that I couldn't stop laughing. And for some reason, they weren't thrown out, but I used to be. It was one particular history teacher who didn't like me. But we would get hysterically giggly, I remember. And so I think young people are working on that, but what they're doing is doing it online more, which means it's not necessarily shared in the same way. But I know some friends have got this age group of young people, can hear their kids laughing and giggling and saying, no, not really, is that what you did? But they're all still in the same environment of being on the screen and locked up in their homes. And then a lot of wishful future thinking. So when I get out of this, what am I going to do? And with my nieces, when I connect with them, I mean, they're 18 and 20, one's at university, but sort of locked down in her college of just a group of 5 people and doing everything online. They talk about, what they're looking forward to as a possibility. But at the same time, they are very anxious about time lost. And I think that's something we've really got to think carefully about. The shock in the UK was when young people were told they weren't going to be there and they couldn't sit their exams. And of course, that's made a massive knock-on effect of the universities they may go to. It was also very, very ethnically discriminated against and socioeconomically, there's all sorts of political factors at play that weren't thought about. So yeah, I think what they need to do, we've got to hope that they retain their invention and they not invention, what's the word, sort of fascination for what comes next, and to think about how they can deal with that proactively. But I do think that a lot of support is needed, even for our own students here. That's really important.
Yeah, I know Tracy and Tracy's got some thoughts on support during the time of COVID, but I think let's go give the people in the audience here a chance to ask your questions. So I'm gonna give you guys first dibs, so if people have questions here, otherwise I can go to the online questions first if you're still formulating your questions, right? I see Chris has raised his hand, so we'll wait for Chris to ask his question.
Hi, thank you very much for those lovely remarks. I learned a lot. I like the idea of solastalgia. I'll try to use that. I'm struck though, Tracy, if I can direct my comments at you, please, by what appears to be a contradiction in your comments. It's nothing terrible. It's just it's that you end with the important call for us to care for young people in a way that helps them recapture their youth, something that's been lost in the last year. But you began your remarks by acknowledging that many young people desperately want to get past their youth. They want to be adults as quickly as possible. So how do we wrestle with this desire to care for them, to help them recover their youth at the same time that they want to get out of that period of their life and be adults as quickly as possible?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think the imperative to be adults as quickly as possible is quite common amongst children generally. But what's happened is that those markers that mean they feel they have made those achievements or have passed through, because that point of transition is so powerful about what they're supposed to do and where they think they're heading. And because that's been put on hold, I think they've got to sort of reverse and think backwards a little bit, not backwards in a negative way, but to sort of reflect on what they have done through the year or the previous time and not forget that and not see it as lost time. And the reason in my slides I had the stones there, or paintings, was because it became a very common way of getting children, and it's predominantly children, but it's also teenagers got involved as well, of painting these stones was quite therapeutic and calming, stopped them being bored. And then they were able to take these as gifts to their local church or their community centre. And many, particularly in Scotland, actually, there are lots of commitments to placing the stones in sort of snake routes through. You saw some of them trailing around walls. And this was a way of each person contributing something to their community as a way of using time. Parents saying, oh, why don't you join this and paint a stone and get out of the house, kind of thing. And so there's those, and lots of those were young people who invented the idea and said, oh, what can we do with these now we've done them? Can we do something? And so they will be in memoria, really, around different places. And some of them have gone into museums already. But I think that young people are very good at holding things in stasis of the sense of being partly something and something else. And that's something they have to work through. So this idea of trying to recapture that time they've lost, but nevertheless try and think about using it productively, I think is a balance that they're going to have to work harder at. But also, I think it's given them time to think, okay, what do I want to do? I had all these milestones to tick off, and I knew I was going to university, and now that's been cancelled, or I knew I'd go into my first job, and that's not happening. Then I think rethinking what happens next is potentially something that will support them. But of course, it so depends on whose support, what resources they've got, what kind of networks they're in, and those kinds of elements that we know make very different circumstances for people. Thanks for the question.
Thanks so much, Tracy. I'm going to take a question online right now. I'm going to read it out. It's for Chuan. What do you think about the fact that we don't think about the meaningfulness of spending time or even of the passing of time unless we have a moment of time away from those ways of spending, of passing time? Okay. So I think this person is asking you to reflect a little bit about the meaningfulness of spending time. How do we think about the meaningfulness of spending time, right? And why, in order for us to think about the meaningfulness of spending time, we'd have to have time on our hands also, right? So how can we think about the meaningfulness of spending time? How might we think more productively about the meaningfulness of spending time, of time passing?
Thank you for the question, for the person who raised it. I suppose part of what I was sharing in my opening thoughts was the fact that sometimes the experience of feeling out of sync with time, right, is what provokes us to begin to ask about meaningfulness, right, of the passing time. What counts for us as being well and living meaningfully? And it can come in really unexpected settings, right? As I was sharing, sometimes on occasions of boredom, right, or deep boredom, and with conversations, that requires a certain mindful awareness, right, of the present, right? A sense of time passing, maybe sometimes a slight anxiety about it before we would begin to wonder about some of these meanings. And one of the things that I'm discovering is how much we need a kind of self-kindness, right, in that process before we're willing to dig deeper, right, into our passing of time and whether or not it's meaningful. If these questions are not raised right in the right space, with the right tone, with the right people around us, then we tend to avoid the question, right, about the meaningfulness of time, because it comes with weight, right, and psychological stress. And sometimes it can be easier to distract ourselves away from asking these questions. But if you pair it with a certain self-kindness, right, yeah, then that allows you to go deeper, right, with this kind of mindful awareness that allows you to explore the meaningfulness of time. Yeah.
Thanks, Chuan Fei. I see a hand up there. Jessica has a question.
Thanks, everyone, for this discussion. I think my question is a short one, maybe a simple one. I was thinking of the quote posted at the beginning by Merleau-Ponty, that a measure of time is that time is someone. And I was wondering if you might amend this. So I was thinking that because the measure of time is changing now, maybe time is no one, or time is the same someone.
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, I'll reply. Thank
Question
you.
goes to anyone.
Yeah. Chuan Fei, maybe you
Maybe
start
I'll
us
start
off.
and
Yeah.
then
Yeah,
Tracy can
yeah.
come. Yeah. It's a great question, I think, because, I've spoken of the ways in which the passing of time, also comes with an embodied perspective. And of course, part of our embodied perspectives often struggles, right, with different ways of carving out time. And sometimes in order to coordinate time, right, with other people, we have to rely on what we might regard as certain objective measures of time as well. And a lot of that then creates that mess, right, of us having to struggle with different competing measures of time, right? Yeah. I don't know if Tracy.
Yes, I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, I've sort of been slightly confounded by the notion that time is someone for a while, and I'm kind of working it through, I guess. But I think, yes, I suppose one of the things is that for many people, time has possibly been absent, and the sense that because there's no markers of having to do something by a certain time, like get up at 7 a.m., get kids up and do all the stuff, drop them off at school, that rush of the day, I'm sure that many people are relieved that they've had breaks from that. And, potentially that could be interesting. But I suppose it really depends very much on how those around, for my case, thinking about children and young people, is how those around themselves deal with time. If you're waiting to find out whether you're losing your job or not, then time becomes someone who can take all of that away from you. And if it's an alternative of getting the positive, then of course there's the anticipation of what it will be like. So I do think really time is problematic in terms of an enforcing of using time up to constrain people, or people have had to work way much harder and harder through time, you know, the exploitation we've seen in factories and so forth, then I think, I don't know about whether time is a being, really. I think it's about how, I guess it's us being in time that then makes us think about how we utilize time, or not even utilize, but we draw upon it.
I'm going to ask a question at this point. I know there's another question up there, but I think that question has been answered already, right, in this response. So I'm going to pick up on this point about the who or what is time, right? Hang on, I'm trying to manage pages and everything else. So what if we thought, okay, about time, if we thought of time as borrowed or a gift, right? Something that time before we die. So right now we're talking about COVID as an exceptional time, right? And yet in many ways, when we've been talking about time, we realize that for some people, time hasn't changed very much. As in, like, if you were marginalized to begin with, maybe there's a heightened sense of that marginalization. But in this period, maybe it's giving you different ways to think about what you might do with the time you have, right? So I find myself reflecting a little bit more about what matters to me, right? If I thought about this particular time during COVID and I saw it as part of my time before I die, or part of the time I have that I've taken from someone else, then how might we live differently or think differently, right? So I want you to maybe reflect on this a little bit in relation to what you've learned from each other about time. So time as a gift, time as something that we borrow from the next generation or from the one that came before us, right? And maybe to reflect a little bit on what you've heard about each other's work and musings about time.
Okay. Yeah, I like this question. I think it's an important one to ask. And that's why I talked about time being something that we should give, it should be, you know, we should give time, we should give a wealth of time to each other rather than the wealthy being the ones who have time. And I think that time is a gift. And sometimes it can be a disappointment in the sense you're going to attend something and then you find it's cancelled. You think, oh no, I really wanted to go to that. But then you think, but now I've got an hour's time that I didn't know I had. So, and there was I read on radio for a long time ago now, and it sort of stuck in my head. There was a poet who couldn't get to this small Welsh village to be able to deliver her poetry, and she was disappointed that it had to be cancelled. But she decided to write about what the people who were going to that event would have felt when it was cancelled, and what did they do with their time. So she wrote this poem about, you know, he went to this place. So she made up characters, and I think that's really important. And I do think that I'm very hopeful. I know I've had more time to think than ever before, but I'm not sure I'm thinking about what my employers are expecting me to think about and do. I'm thinking about what my plan is for the next few years. What do I want to achieve for myself, but also how do I want to sort of stop thinking, when I get to this point, then I'll be doing what I really want to do. And so I'm really reflecting hard on then, okay, how can I keep my employers happy, but also get my thread through so that I start living the life think I'm waiting for now.
Fantastic, thanks, Tracy. What about you, Chuan?
Thank you very much for that, Tracy. So I'm going back to your question about time as a gift or time that is precious. And that kind of provokes us to think then of time as something that's value laden, isn't it? Yeah, and also time that's relational in some sense because it's something that others have given us. And I remembered in Tracy's remarks, she spoke a little bit about our concern with the fair distribution of time as well. And yeah, that makes me think about two ways of taking the point, right? That time is precious. We might say time is precious, right? And use that as a thought to discipline ourselves, right? To do more, right? To make sure you don't squander the time, to use it well. And I think it comes with a certain tone and a certain set of expectations. But you know, we could say time is a gift too, right? And time is precious, and the time that we have with other people. And spoken in that voice, with that tone, something else might change, right? In what we can create in that moment. And I have to share this one experience I had, which comes from, being in the counseling space, right? And that's the increasing sense sometimes that, you're rushing, right? You're trying to clear all the things you think you have to do, right? As part of this intervention, and you have to make sure you get the results right and then get feedback from the client, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a time when I kind of reflected on this idea about time as being precious and a gift that this client had given me in coming into this space and being courageous enough to do that. And what I did was I slowed down dramatically, right? My expectations of what I could do. And I can't tell you except that the lived experience of it was that time seemed to expand. That then I was no longer rushing and I seemed to have all the time in the world to attend to this person and his needs in conversation. And I've since had experience even in teaching, right, of what happens when you slow down, right, and come into the space, treat it as a gift that the students have given you. And I encourage people to experiment, right, with this in the classroom, in relationships, and see what happens, right, when you regard time as a gift in that sense.
Thank you so much. I am conscious of time right now, as always. And I wonder if we have any last questions from the audience here, just to check if there's a last question. Okay, if not, I'm gonna just thank our two guests, right? I'm sure you have more questions yourself, and they'll be hanging around a little bit after here. So if you were too shy to ask your questions, or if you felt like we hadn't done enough, right? And that there are other things you want to bring up, please join us in the front here and have a little chat with us. But at this point, I'd like to remind you that we have two other critical conversations coming up. The first, or the second rather, the one coming up next, is next Wednesday, right? On reframing the past, where we meet with Dr. John Solomon, who's a historian, and a visual artist, Debbie Ding, and we'll be talking about reframing the past. So this one will be looking more at methodological approaches, right, in history, and having conversations between a visual artist and a historian. The second or the third critical conversation rather is telling our stories, where we have two interesting sort of guests, right? The first is a filmmaker, Sherman Ong, and the other is Dr. Sarah Tabia Samuels, okay? And they'll be talking to us about how we might tell our stories about time. And they both have very interesting approaches here. So Sherman's work on, say, Asia, the region, and how we come to understand Asia as a region, and Sarah Tabia looking at nature as a way to conceptualize and think through a time, right? So she's so I think we'll have some interesting use of sort of the media that we will be dealing with is film and photography. So please do join us. That's the following Wednesday. So we're talking about 2 more Wednesdays of critical conversation that we're going to have. So we hope to see you there with us, right? And lastly, but not least, we'd like for you to give us your feedback. So if you have your phone with you, you can scan that barcode and give us your feedback about critical conversations, and remember, this is the start of festival season for us here on campus. So this is the NUS Festival of Arts, and the theme this year is A Question of Time, right? So we have lots of interesting sort of activities and events planned, and it's a hybrid festival. So if you want to be in the face-to-face sort of situation, you need to be quick about it and book your space, right? Otherwise, you can definitely join us online, right? So please visit our festival website and check out all the really cool things that are happening this March for NUS Campus Arts Festival, all right? So without further ado, I'd like to thank my two guests, right? I feel like we've only sort of touched the tip of the iceberg. I had a whole list of questions here, but we don't have enough time. So I almost feel like I need to have a separate blog about this, right? So, let's continue that conversation, right? I'm so happy to have you guys here with me, and it was a pleasure, right? Thank you so much. Please, a round of applause for our guests.